What if I told you that the most expensive thing you'll ever pay for is a lie? Not even your own lie, but one you were forced to carry for so long it became a part of your bones. For 30 years, I thought my life in San Francisco was the price I had paid for my freedom from that lie. I was wrong. It was just the down payment. The dinner rush at Aperture is my symphony. Every clink of silverware on porcelain, every soft murmur of conversation, every command hissed in the kitchen, I conduct it all. Here, at 38, I am the master of a universe I built from scratch. A world of precise angles, predictable outcomes, and a safe 2,000 miles from the suffocating humidity of a small town in Ohio. Control isn't just a preference for me, it's the very air I breathe. My phone vibrated against the cool granite of the host stand. A private number. I never answer private numbers during service, but this one was different. It pulsed with a familiar dread. The screen lit up with two words that made the meticulously crafted universe around me freeze. Ohio. Home. Have you ever felt a phone call weigh 1,000 pounds before you even answer it? I excused myself, my heels clicking a sharp, steady rhythm on the polished concrete floor, a sound of authority I desperately needed to feel. I answered it in the steel and silence of the wine cellar. My mother's voice was a familiar blend of Midwestern steel and manufactured frailty, a weapon she'd perfected over 4 decades. "Emma, honey, it's about Ryan." I leaned against a rack of perfectly chilled Sauvignon Blanc, the restaurant's hum a distant buzz. "What about him, Mom?" A pause, pregnant with calculated drama. "It's his leg. The old injury. It's bad, Em. The arthritis. The doctor said it was inevitable after the fall." The fall. Not his fall. The fall. The singular event that had defined my entire childhood, the original sin from which my life was a constant act of penance. I was 8 years old. He was 10, the golden boy, the football prodigy. I remembered the heat, the smell of sun-baked dirt and steel on that construction site. I remembered his laughter. But the crucial moment, the one where I supposedly distracted him or pushed him, that part has always been a smudge of terror and confusion in my memory, a memory written for me by others. "What do the doctors say?" I asked, my voice as crisp and sterile as the cellar air. I was a restaurateur discussing a supplier issue, not a sister discussing the brother whose future she'd been told she'd broken. "He needs an operation, a full replacement. It's a very expensive operation, Emma." There it was. Not a request, but a statement of fact laid at my feet like an invoice, a bill that had been accruing interest for 30 years. I closed my eyes, and for a second, I wasn't in my sleek, successful restaurant. I was a little girl again, covered in dust, watching my brother scream on the ground. I saw my parents' faces, not looking at his mangled leg, but at me. The accusation in their eyes was the true injury that day, and it had never healed. It was a ghost that sat at every family dinner, a silent guest at every holiday. It was the reason I'd left for the coast the day I turned 18 and never truly looked back. "Without it, he'll lose his job at the plant," my mother continued, her voice cracking with perfect timing. "He can barely walk as it is. We don't know what we're going to do." The unspoken part hung heavy in the air between San Francisco and Ohio. You did this. You owe him this. The golden boy's life didn't turn out the way anyone expected. And for 3 decades, I had been the convenient one-word explanation for why. I could have said no. I could have listed the reasons. I could have reminded her that I hadn't spoken to Ryan in nearly a year, that our relationship was a ghost limb, still aching where it had been severed. But what do you do when your entire identity has been built around a debt? Refusing to pay feels like you might simply cease to exist. The bill had finally come due. "I'll book a flight," I said, the words tasting like rust. The symphony upstairs continued without its conductor. But down here, in the cold and the quiet, my carefully controlled world had just shattered. Flying from San Francisco to Ohio is like traveling back in time, but not in a good way. The crisp, cool Pacific air I left behind was replaced by a thick, wet blanket of humidity the moment I stepped out of the Columbus airport. It was the air of my childhood, heavy with the scent of damp earth, cut grass, and memories I had spent 20 years trying to outrun. Do you know why people who escape small towns never look back? It's because the town never lets you forget who you were, only who they decided you are. The house hadn't just shrunk, as all childhood homes do. It seemed to have darkened, the white siding now a weary gray, the cheerful blue shutters faded to the color of a bruise. I stood on the driveway, my rental car ticking as it cooled, and felt the weight of the place settle on my shoulders. This wasn't a home. It was a museum dedicated to a single terrible moment in time, and I was the prime exhibit. My mother opened the door before I could knock, her smile as tight and brittle as old lace. And then I saw him. Ryan. My brother. My childhood idol. The boy who could run faster and climb higher than anyone. The 40-year-old man who stood in the dim hallway was a ghost of that boy. He wasn't just limping. His entire body was contorted around the pain in his right leg, a constant 30-year-old echo of a 10-year-old's mistake. His face, which should have been handsome, was a mask of sullen resentment. He looked at me, and his eyes held no welcome, only the cold, hard glint of a creditor assessing a long overdue debt. Dinner was a masterclass in unspoken tension. My mother served a pot roast that was both overcooked and underseasoned, a fitting metaphor for our family dynamic. My father, a man who had long ago abdicated his role for a quiet life in front of the television, ate in silence, his gaze fixed on his plate. Ryan answered my questions about his son with monosyllables, his fork scraping aggressively against the ceramic. The air was thick with everything we weren't saying. It was a language I was fluent in. Finally, my mother cleared her throat, the signal that the main event was about to begin. She dabbed her lips with a paper napkin, her eyes shining with a martyr's tears. "We're so grateful you came, Emma. It means the world." She glanced at Ryan, whose face remained a stone tablet of bitterness. "We didn't know where else to turn. With his leg. It's been so hard on him. On all of us." This was the preamble, the gentle loosening of the purse strings. She reached across the table and placed her hand on mine. Her skin was cool, her grip surprisingly strong. "This operation, it's a chance to finally fix things, to put it all behind us." Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, loaded with the weight of 3 decades of blame. "It's your chance to make it right, Emma." It wasn't a plea. It wasn't a request. It was a verdict, delivered with the quiet authority of a judge who had made up her mind long ago. They weren't asking for my help. They were cashing in the guilt they had so carefully invested in me my entire life. I looked from my mother's expectant face to my brother's resentful glare. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He just stared at the table, a silent, broken monument to my supposed crime. In that moment, something inside me shifted. The guilt was still there, a familiar ache in my chest. But underneath it, a new feeling began to stir, cold and sharp. For the first time, it didn't feel like a memory of my failure. It felt like a perfectly executed lie. I heard myself agree to pay for everything, the words leaving my mouth before I had fully formed them, a reflex conditioned by years of penance. The price of guilt had been set. Now, all I had to do was pay it. Sleep doesn't come in a house that holds its breath. My childhood bedroom was a time capsule, preserved with an almost religious reverence. Faded posters of bands I'd long forgotten were still tacked to the walls. The same floral quilt was folded neatly on the single bed. Have you ever tried to sleep in a museum dedicated to a version of you that no longer exists? The air was stale with the ghosts of old dreams and one persistent, suffocating nightmare. I lay in the dark, the mattress springs groaning a familiar protest, and stared at the ceiling where a galaxy of plastic glow-in-the-dark stars had long since lost their light. This was where the guilt was born. In this room, in the nights after the fall, I would lie awake, replaying the story my parents had crafted for me. The story of a careless little sister and her fallen hero brother. For 30 years, I had accepted it as gospel. But why, tonight, did it feel like a forgery? A flash, unbidden and sharp. Not a memory, but a sensation. The heat. I was suddenly 8 years old again, the sun a physical weight on my small shoulders. I could feel the grit of dust on my sweaty skin, smell the baked metallic scent of the half-finished building site. It wasn't a memory of the accident. It was the memory of the moments before. The air was buzzing with summer, with freedom, with the dangerous thrill of being somewhere we weren't supposed to be. I sat up, my heart thumping a strange, erratic rhythm. I tried to push the feeling away, to retreat back to the safety of my controlled San Francisco mind. But another fragment broke through. Ryan's laugh. Not a scream of pain, but a cocky, 10-year-old laugh, echoing in the hot, still air. He was showing off. He was invincible. That part was so clear, so vivid. He was the golden boy, and I was his terrified, adoring audience. So I tried to force it. I closed my eyes and tried to walk through the memory step by step, the way a detective might reconstruct a crime scene. There's the steel beam, high off the ground. There's Ryan, walking across it like a tightrope artist. There's me, on the ground, my hands clenched into small fists. I remember looking up at him, my neck aching. I remember a feeling of absolute terror. I remember opening my mouth to shout something. And then, nothing. It's a void, a clean, perfect cut in the film of my life. I have the before, the heat, the dust, his laugh. I have the after, his scream, the impossible angle of his leg, the blood, the sudden swarm of panicked adults, and their eyes, all turning to me. But the moment itself? The push? The distraction? The thing I supposedly did? It isn't there. It has never been there. I'd always assumed trauma had erased it. A mercy, perhaps. But what if it wasn't a mercy? What if the reason I couldn't remember my crime was because I had never committed it? The thought was so radical, so profoundly destabilizing, that I felt a wave of nausea. The guilt that had defined me, that had shaped every major decision of my adult life, was a heavy, familiar burden. But this new feeling, this cold, creeping doubt, it was terrifying. It threatened to pull the entire foundation of my life out from under me. For 30 years, I'd been haunted by a memory. Now, for the first time, I was terrified by the lack of one. How do you talk to a ghost? Not the kind that rattles chains, but the kind that sits across from you at breakfast, wears your brother's face, and haunts you with a past he refuses to discuss. The morning after my arrival, I found Ryan in the garage, a place that smelled of stale oil and failure. He was sitting on a wobbly stool, staring at a lawnmower engine that looked like it hadn't run in a decade. He was a monument to arrested development, surrounded by the ghosts of his own broken potential. I leaned against the doorframe, the cool morning air a welcome contrast to the stuffiness inside. He didn't look up, but I knew he felt my presence. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. I decided to approach it like a business negotiation. State the offer, then the terms. I'm transferring the money for the surgery today, I said. His shoulders tensed, but he still didn't turn. The full amount. You can book the pre-op appointments. There was no thank you. Not even a grunt of acknowledgement. Just the grim acceptance of a man collecting a long overdue payment. This was the moment. The pivot. There's just one thing, Ryan, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. He finally turned, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. I want us to talk. Really talk. About that day. The shift in the atmosphere was instantaneous. It was like a pressure drop before a storm. The sullen resentment in his face sharpened into something harder, more defensive. What would you do if the one topic the world told you to discuss was the one topic you couldn't bear to touch? His laugh was a harsh, ugly sound, completely devoid of humor. What's there to talk about? He rasped, turning back to the dead engine. It was 30 years ago. It happened. End of story. His words were a brick wall, hastily erected. It's not the end of the story for me, I pushed, taking a step into the garage. I was there. You know what you did, he said, his voice low and bitter. He loaded each word with a history of pain, a final damning judgment he'd been nursing for 3 decades. I had to know. The doubt from the night before was a physical itch under my skin. But I don't, Ryan. That's the problem. I don't really remember it. It's just a blur. He stood up then, his bad leg dragging, and faced me. For a moment I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Was it panic? Fear? It was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a cold fury. Don't play games, Emma, it's a little late for that. This surgery, it's the least you can do. He turned his back on me, a clear and final dismissal. I stood there for a long time after he limped back into the house, the smell of oil and dust filling my lungs. He hadn't just refused to talk. He had reacted with the violent defensiveness of a man guarding a secret. A true victim, I thought, might be angry, but they wouldn't be afraid to remember. Ryan was afraid. He didn't want to talk about the past, not because it hurt him, but because he was terrified of what might be revealed if he did. The wall he'd built wasn't to keep the memory of his pain fresh. It was to keep the truth buried. And I realized, with a chilling certainty, that I was no longer trying to remember what I had done. I was trying to uncover what he was so desperate to hide. Ryan's denial wasn't a wall. It was a locked door. And if he wouldn't give me the key, I would have to find a crowbar. I spent the afternoon pacing the creaking floors of the house, the gears in my mind turning, grinding against 30 years of rust. I replayed my conversation with Ryan, his fear, his anger. He said, "You were there. You know what you did." But that wasn't quite right. Weren't there 3 of us that day? It hit me with the force of a physical blow. Of course, there was a third person, a witness. Mark. What do you do when your past holds a secret you can't unlock? You find the person who holds the other key, Mark Kowalski, our childhood friend. The quiet, lanky boy who was always trailing after Ryan, a loyal shadow to the golden boy's son. A quick search on my phone confirmed it. Kowalski's Auto Repair, Main Street. He never left. Some people are anchors, I suppose, holding a town in place. Others, like me, are just ghosts who visit. Kowalski's Auto Repair smelled of grease, sweat, and burnt coffee. The air was split by the scream of a power wrench and the tinny sound of classic rock spitting from a dusty radio. A man in grease-stained overalls was hunched over the engine of a pickup truck, his back to me. "Mark?" I asked, my voice sounding thin and out of place, like a wine glass in a hardware store. He straightened up slowly, wiping his hands on an already filthy rag, and turned. The boy was gone, replaced by a tired man with lines etched around his eyes. He squinted at me, a flicker of recognition warring with disbelief. "Emma? Emma Scott?" Holy hell. The small talk was a clumsy, awkward dance. He asked about California. I asked about his family. We were two strangers trying to pretend we still knew each other, the ghost of a shared history standing between us. I could see the question in his eyes. Why are you here? So I cut through the pretense. I'm in town because of Ryan, I said, watching his face carefully. His leg. He needs surgery. Mark's friendly demeanor vanished. He picked up a wrench and began methodically tightening a bolt that didn't seem to need it, his knuckles white. He was building a wall, just like Ryan had. Yeah, I heard he was having a tough time with it, he mumbled, his focus entirely on the engine. That was a bad day, Emma. A long time ago. His tone was dismissive, a clear signal to drop it. But I couldn't. I was too close. Mark, I need to ask you about that day. I don't remember it clearly. He stopped, the wrench clattering against the engine block. He wouldn't look at me. What's to remember? Kid stuff. We shouldn't have been there. Ryan fell. That's it. He was reciting the official story, the town's accepted history. But his voice was hollow, lacking any conviction. This was my last card to play. I took a breath. I'm paying for the operation, I said quietly. All of it. Mark froze. He slowly placed the wrench down on a metal tray, the sound unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. He turned to face me, and for the first time, I saw an emotion in his eyes that wasn't just tired politeness. It was a raw, 30-year-old anger. It was pity. After all this time? He asked, his voice a low, bitter rasp. My God, Emma. He shook his head, looking at me as if I were the world's biggest fool. He's still letting you pay for that? He's still letting you pay for that? The words hung in the greasy air, thick and incomprehensible. They didn't fit into any version of the world I knew. It was like hearing someone speak a language you almost understood, but every crucial verb was wrong. What did he mean? Letting me. As if I had a choice. As if this wasn't a debt I was born to repay. What are you talking about, Mark? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The carefully constructed control I prized was beginning to fracture. He let out a long, slow breath, a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of 30 years. He looked past me, out the open garage door, as if searching for the right words on the dusty horizon. I shouldn't have said anything. It's not my place. He started to turn back to the engine, to the safety of his routine. No, I said, stepping forward, my voice finding a strength I didn't know it had. You can't say that and then walk away. It is your place. You were there. Tell me what you remember. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and what I saw in his eyes was a deep, weary pity. He wiped his hands on the rag one last time and tossed it onto a workbench. All right, he said, his voice low. But not here. He led me to a tiny, cluttered office in the back, a room that smelled of stale coffee and paperwork. He closed the door, shutting out the noise of the garage, and for a moment, we were just two kids again, about to share a terrible secret. Have you ever been on the verge of learning a truth that you know will destroy you, yet you crave it more than anything? We shouldn't have been there, he began, echoing his earlier words. But this time, they were a confession, not a dismissal. But Ryan, you remember what he was like. He was 10 years old, going on 20. He thought he was invincible, and that place was his kingdom. He paused, gathering the memory. He found that steel beam, the one stretched between the two concrete walls, and he decided he was going to jump it. From the high one to the low one. It was a stupid, dangerous stunt. A fragment of memory flared in my mind, Ryan's cocky laugh, exactly as I'd remembered it in the dark of my bedroom. You were terrified, Mark continued, his eyes fixed on mine, confirming the feelings I could never fully grasp. You were standing on the ground, just a little thing, and you were crying. I remember it so clearly. You kept yelling, "Ryan, don't, please get down." You were begging him. My breath caught in my throat. I remembered my fear. I remembered pleading. He was getting mad, Mark said, shaking his head at the memory. He hated anyone thinking he couldn't do something. He called you a coward. And then, he told you to shut up, and he pushed you. The room went silent. The hum of the office refrigerator sounded like a jet engine. What? I whispered. He pushed you, Mark repeated, his voice firm, leaving no room for doubt. Not to hurt you. It was a frustrated, angry shove to get you out of his eyeline. You stumbled back. But in that moment of turning to push you, he lost his balance. He wobbled for a second. And then he fell. The blank space in my memory, the smudge of white noise, was suddenly filled with a blinding, horrifying clarity. It wasn't my action that filled the void. It was his. I felt the floor tilt beneath me. I was a restaurateur. I built my life on facts, on inventory and receipts, on cause and effect. And the central cause of my entire life, the foundational event, was a lie. When the adults came running, Mark said softly, his voice full of an old sorrow. Your dad, the construction foreman. Ryan was just a scared kid. He'd done something stupid, and he was hurt. And he was terrified of the trouble he was in. He was crying on the ground, pointing right at you. He said you distracted him. And everyone, Emma, everyone just looked at you. The weight of 30 years didn't vanish. It simply changed form. The heavy, shapeless burden of guilt I had carried transformed in an instant. It became something sharp, something defined. It became the clear, cold, solid weight of a lie. I wasn't the villain of my own story. I was the first victim. The little girl who cried for her brother's safety was sacrificed to protect the pride of the golden boy who couldn't bear to admit he had simply made a mistake. A hot, unfamiliar fury began to burn away the cold shock. I stood up, the world snapping back into sharp, painful focus. I had come home to pay for my sin. But I had just discovered I was the only one who had been sinned against. The drive back from Mark's garage was a blur of green and gray. The familiar Ohio landscape, once a symbol of my suffocating past, now looked like the scene of a 30-year-long crime. What does truth feel like when it finally arrives? Not like a warm, healing light. It feels like a block of ice forming in your chest, a cold, hard certainty that freezes everything it touches. The guilt I had carried was a heavy, shapeless thing. This new knowledge was a weapon. It was sharp, perfectly weighted, and I knew exactly how I was going to use it. I didn't knock. I walked into the house, and the false peace of the living room shattered. My mother was on the couch knitting. My father was staring blankly at a game show. Ryan was at the kitchen table, nursing a beer. They all looked up, startled by the force of my entrance. The guilty, apologetic daughter they were used to was gone. In her place stood a woman who had just had her entire life handed back to her, and she was furious. "Turn off the TV," I said. It wasn't a request. My mother's knitting needles stopped clicking. "Emma, what's wrong?" My father fumbled for the remote. I walked to the kitchen doorway, my eyes locked on my brother. He could see it on my face. He knew. His sullen expression tightened with a familiar, defensive anger, but underneath it, I now saw the flicker of pure terror. "We're going to talk," I announced to the room. "All of us. About what really happened 30 years ago." My mother started with the usual platitudes. "Honey, we don't need to dredge all that up again." But I cut her off. "I went to see Mark Kowalski today," I said, keeping my gaze fixed on Ryan. The color drained from his face. He slammed his beer bottle down on the table, a little too hard. What? You went to see that grease monkey? Why? His voice was loud, brittle with a panicky rage. What's he got to do with anything? The performance was almost convincing. Almost. He was there, Ryan, I said, my voice dangerously quiet. He remembers things a little differently than you do. I laid out Mark's story like a prosecutor presenting evidence. I described the heat, the dust, the dangerous stunt. With every word, Ryan's denial grew more frantic. He's lying. He always had it in for me. You'd believe him over your own brother? He looked to our parents for support, his eyes wide and pleading. He was playing the part they had cast him in, the tragic hero. But I had the key, the one detail that would shatter the performance. He told me everything, I said, taking a step closer. He told me I was on the ground, crying, begging you to stop. He told me you called me a coward. Ryan's face was a mask of disbelief, but his hands were trembling. And then he told me the part I could never remember, I said, my voice dropping, each word a perfectly placed stone. He told me that right before you fell, you shoved me. That was it. The final blow. Ryan crumpled as if I had physically struck him. The rage, the denial, all of it evaporated, leaving behind the terrified 10-year-old boy who had started this all. He sank into his chair and buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent, ragged sobs. The room was utterly still, the only sound his choked breathing and the frantic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, counting out the first seconds of our new, unbearable reality. The truth was finally out. It wasn't a whisper. It was a detonation. What is the sound of a world breaking? It's not a loud crash. It's the sudden, absolute silence that follows a confession, a silence so heavy it feels like the air has been sucked out of the room. Ryan's sobs were the only thing moving in the vacuum, a pathetic, ragged sound that offered no comfort, only confirmation. I watched my parents, and it was like seeing two statues slowly realize they were carved from sand and the tide was coming in. My mother was the first to move. Her face, a moment ago etched with concern for her wounded son, was now a canvas of utter disbelief. The family myth, the story of the golden boy struck down by a careless sister, was her masterpiece. She had curated it, polished it, and presented it as truth for 3 decades. To have it smashed on the living room floor was not just a shock, it was a personal, artistic failure. "Ryan," she whispered, her voice thin and reedy. "Is this true? Tell me she's wrong." It was a plea, a desperate attempt to glue the shards of her story back together. But Ryan couldn't speak. He could only nod his head into his hands, a gesture of such complete defeat that it was undeniable. My father, who had been a silent fixture in the corner of our family for as long as I could remember, made a sound, a low groan of anguish. He looked from Ryan's shaking form to my face, and for the first time I saw not a passive observer, but a man drowning in a 30-year-old ocean of shame. He knew. I could see it in his eyes. He had always known, on some level, that the story didn't add up. He had just chosen the easier path of silence. "We believed you," my mother said, her voice rising with a hysterical edge. She wasn't speaking to Ryan. She was speaking to the ghost of the perfect son she thought she had. "We sacrificed. We thought—" She couldn't finish the sentence. She couldn't say my name. To acknowledge me as the victim would be to admit her own role as an accomplice. So instead, the chaos began. The dam of unspoken resentments didn't just break. It exploded. "You never wanted to see anything else!" My father suddenly roared, his voice rusty from disuse. He stood up, his fists clenched, his face a mottled red. He rounded on my mother. "He was your golden boy, your perfect, flawless boy. It was easier to blame her, wasn't it? It was always easier to blame Emma." The accusation, so long buried, hung in the air like poison gas. Me! My mother shrieked, her disbelief turning to righteous fury. You were his father. You were there. You said nothing, not one word. It was a wildfire of blame, jumping from one person to the next. Ryan lifted his tear-streaked face, his eyes full of a new, desperate anger. You both did it, he yelled, his voice cracking. I was 10 years old. I was scared. But you loved it. You loved the story. The poor, brave Ryan whose career was stolen from him. It was better than having a son who was just stupid and clumsy. The family mythology was being torn apart, limb from limb, by the very people who had created it. I stood there, untouched by the flames, and watched the world they had built on my back burn to the ground. There was no satisfaction, no triumph. Just the cold, clear, empty view of the ruins. The shouting died down, not into peace, but into exhaustion. The fire had consumed all the fuel, leaving behind only the smoking, blackened husks of our relationships. My mother was huddled on the couch, looking small and ancient. My father stood by the window, his back to the room, a posture of shame he had perfected over a lifetime. And Ryan just sat at the table, a 40-year-old man who looked like a lost little boy, the lie he'd built his life on now a pile of ash around him. I let the silence stretch, letting them sit in the wreckage they had created. The anger I felt in Mark's garage had burned out, and in its place was a vast, cold emptiness. I had spent my entire adult life running from a ghost, only to find out the ghost was a scarecrow they had built to keep me in my place. What do you do when the war is over and you've won, but your entire country is a ruin? You don't celebrate. You start dictating the terms of reconstruction. I walked over to the dining table and sat down opposite my brother. I looked at each of them, my gaze steady, my voice as calm and level as if I were discussing the evening specials with my staff. The operation, I said, and the word cut through the thick silence. I'll pay for it. A flicker of something. Relief? Hope? Crossed my mother's face. Ryan didn't look up, but I held up a hand before anyone could speak. But let's be very clear about what this is. This is not a gift. It is not forgiveness. It is not me making things right. I leaned forward, my voice dropping but losing none of its steel. For 30 years, you have all held a debt over my head. A debt for something I never did. Now, that debt is canceled. But there is a new one in its place. I am paying for this surgery because Ryan is still my brother, and I don't want to see him crippled. That is the only reason. But you will all be paying me back. Not with money. I don't need your money. I looked from my mother's confused face to my father's rigid back, and finally to Ryan's bowed head. You will pay me back with the truth, I said. You will pay me back by doing the one thing this family has never done, the actual, painful work of fixing itself. We will all go to family therapy, a professional, together. You will learn to speak to each other without lies. You will learn to take responsibility. You, Mom, and you, Dad, for choosing an easy lie over a difficult truth. And you, Ryan, for building your whole life on top of it. I stood up, the finality of my words settling over the room like a shroud. Those are my terms. Therapy. For all of us. That is the first payment on your new debt to me. Take it or leave it. What does the first payment on a 30-year-old lie look like? It doesn't look like a check or a wire transfer. It looks like 4 people sitting in the strained silence of a rental car, driving to a beige office building on a Tuesday morning. The air was so thick with unspoken words that I felt like I was drowning in it. No one knew the new rules. The old ones, blame Emma, protect Ryan, pretend everything is fine, had been incinerated. We were a family without a script, and the silence was terrifying. The therapist's office was aggressively neutral. Beige walls, abstract art that meant nothing, a ficus tree that was probably plastic. Dr. Albright, a woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense haircut, gestured to a semicircle of chairs. The seating arrangement was a diagnosis in itself. My mother and father sat together, but with a foot of empty space between them. Ryan slumped into a chair by himself, his gaze fixed on the worn carpet. I chose the one furthest away, an observer. I was the one who had demanded this, but I felt no part of it. I was the creditor, here to witness the first installment. So, Dr. Albright began, her voice calm and even, a stark contrast to the chaos in the room. Tell me what brings you all here. My mother, ever the family's designated spokesperson for polite fictions, spoke first. We've had a long-standing misunderstanding in our family. It's caused a great deal of pain. My father snorted, a harsh, ugly sound. It wasn't a misunderstanding, Helen. It was a lie. We're here because we're ashamed. The directness of it was shocking. The first truly honest thing I'd heard him say in years. The doctor's gentle gaze shifted to my brother. Ryan, what would you say? He looked up, his eyes red and swollen. He looked at me, and for a second I saw not the bitter, broken man from the garage, but the 10-year-old boy, terrified and cornered. He opened his mouth, and a sound came out, a dry, rasping croak. He swallowed, tried again. I'm... He couldn't say it. The words, so simple, so necessary, were trapped behind a lifetime of deceit. He shook his head, looking down at his hands, defeated. I don't know how, he whispered. And in that moment, watching him fail, I didn't feel a rush of forgiveness. I felt nothing. Nothing at all. The space where my guilt used to live was now just a cold, hollowed-out cavern. His pathetic, aborted apology wasn't a balm on a wound. It was a transaction. It was the first infinitesimally small coin dropping into an enormous empty vault. It was a single painful step onto a road that stretched for miles. I didn't feel mercy. But as I sat there in that sterile, beige room, I did feel something new, something I hadn't felt in 30 years. The faint, unfamiliar tremor of a beginning. Have you ever waited for a verdict that had nothing to do with guilt or innocence? Hospital waiting rooms are a special kind of purgatory. They are designed for the singular purpose of forcing you to confront your own powerlessness. The vinyl chairs are always too stiff, the coffee is always burnt, and the art on the walls is a study in aggressive blandness. We sat there, the three of us, a fractured family held together by the sterile quiet and the rhythmic beep of distant machinery. For 30 years, a scene like this would have been my personal hell. I would have been the focal point of their anxiety, the silent walking embodiment of the reason we were here. My mother's worried glances would have been tinged with accusation. My father's silence would have been a heavy, condemning judgment. I would have been the scapegoat, absorbing their fear and their resentment. But the scapegoat was gone. In her place was just a sister. And for the first time, the anxiety I felt was clean. It was a simple, uncomplicated worry for my brother, lying on a table under a surgeon's knife. The silence wasn't angry anymore. It was something more fragile, more difficult. It was awkward. We were strangers learning a new language. My mother twisted a tissue in her hands until it was a shredded piece of lint. My father stared at a spot on the opposite wall, his face a grim mask, but he wasn't absent. He was painfully present, stewing in a shame so profound it was almost a physical presence in the chair beside him. There were no roles left to play. The martyr, the silent judge, the golden boy, the guilty daughter, all of them had died in our living room. We were just 3 people in a hospital, waiting. Hours crawled by with the agonizing slowness of a dripping faucet. My mother eventually got up and offered me a cup of vending machine coffee, a gesture so small and normal it felt revolutionary. I said no thank you, and my refusal wasn't a rejection, just a fact. There were no hidden meanings, no coded resentments. The exchange was clean. I realized I wasn't there out of obligation. The debt had been a fiction. I was here because somewhere, buried under 3 decades of lies, was a simple, biological truth. He was my brother, and I didn't want him to be in pain. Finally, a man in green scrubs came through the double doors, his face tired but calm. We all stood up in a single, uncoordinated motion, a unified front of fear. He looked at the chart in his hand, then at us. "Ryan Scott's family?" he asked. My father nodded, unable to speak. The surgeon gave a small, weary smile. "It went very well. The replacement is in, and the procedure was a complete success. He's in recovery now." A collective breath was released, a sound of 3 people stepping back from a cliff's edge. My mother began to cry, quiet tears of relief. But it was my father who broke me. He made a sound, a raw, strangled noise deep in his chest. He turned away from us, facing the wall he had been staring at for hours, and I saw his broad, stoic shoulders begin to shake. He wasn't just crying. He was weeping with the force of a grief he had held back for a lifetime. I had never seen my father cry. Not once. I didn't move to comfort him. I simply stood there and witnessed it. The first honest payment on a debt of truth. The recovery room smelled of antiseptic and sleep. Ryan was a pale, diminished figure against the starched white sheets, an IV line snaking into his arm, his newly repaired leg a bulky, anonymous shape under a thick blanket. He was floating in that strange, milky twilight of post-anesthesia, his eyes half open but not quite seeing. My parents had gone down to the cafeteria, their emotional reserves completely spent. I had offered to stay, and for the first time, my presence felt like a comfort, not a complication. I pulled a chair up to the bedside and just sat, listening to the quiet, steady rhythm of the heart monitor. It was a peaceful sound, a sound of function, of repair. The physical damage, the broken bone that had set our family on its broken course, was finally being mended. But the scar tissue that had grown around it, the thick, ugly layers of lies and resentment, that was a different kind of injury. Could that ever be truly fixed? Or do you just learn to live with the ache? His eyes fluttered open again, and this time, they focused. He saw me, and a flicker of the old defensiveness crossed his face before it was washed away by a wave of exhaustion. He looked down at the mountain his leg made under the blanket. A long, quiet moment passed. He was no longer the golden boy. He wasn't the bitter victim. He was just a man who had undergone a serious surgery, a man who was, for the first time in his adult life, completely vulnerable. "Hey," he rasped, his voice thick and clumsy. "Hey," I said back. It was enough. We sat in that shared silence, the beeping of the monitor the only conversation. I wasn't waiting for an apology anymore. The ultimatum I had delivered, the demand for therapy. It wasn't about forcing an apology. It was about forcing an acknowledgement. It was about ending the fiction. The work of actual healing, I was beginning to realize, was something quieter, something that couldn't be demanded or coerced. He shifted slightly, a grimace of pain flashing across his face. He looked at his leg again, then his eyes found mine. They were clear, stripped of the anger and resentment that had clouded them for so long. They were just the eyes of my brother. "Thanks, Emma," he whispered, the words barely audible over the hum of the machines. His gaze didn't waver. "And I'm sorry." There was no drama, no performance. Just 3 simple words, offered up from the depths of his exhaustion and his shame. They were the words I had waited 30 years to hear. I didn't say, "It's okay." It wasn't okay. A lie had stolen my childhood and warped his life. It had poisoned our parents and hollowed out our family. None of that was okay. Forgiveness wasn't a switch you could just flip. It wasn't a debt that could be cleared with a single payment of 3 words. But as I looked at my brother, pale and broken in that hospital bed, I understood that forgiveness wasn't the destination. It was the path. And he had just taken the first agonizing step. I just nodded. It was all that was needed. That? A year. It takes 1 year for a vintage of wine to mature in a barrel, transforming from raw juice into something with character and depth. It also takes about a year, I've learned, for a family to begin to ferment into something new after its bottle has been completely smashed. The evening rush at Aperture is building, the familiar symphony of clinking glass and low conversation starting its crescendo. A year ago, this sound was my armor. Tonight, it's just the soundtrack to my life. My phone buzzes on the host stand, a soft, unobtrusive vibration. I glance down. Ryan's name. A year ago, that name would have sent a jolt of ice and dread through my veins. Now, it's just a name. I open the message. There's no text, just a video file. I press play. The screen fills with a sun-drenched lawn, the grass impossibly green. In the center of the frame is Ryan and his son, a small boy of about 8. The boy kicks a soccer ball and Ryan, my brother, runs to meet it. He doesn't just run, he sprints. There is no limp. There is no pained, careful gait. He moves with a freedom I have never, in my entire life, seen him possess. He traps the ball, laughs, and kicks it back to his son. The sound of his genuine, unburdened laughter fills the small speaker on my phone. Our weekly therapy sessions are still awkward. My mother still sometimes defaults to the language of martyrdom, but now she catches herself. My father speaks more, but his words are often clumsy and full of a shame he's still learning how to carry. And Ryan is learning to be a man who isn't defined by a lie. Our relationships are not healed. They are covered in scars. But what I've learned is that scars are better than a flawless artificial skin. Scars are proof of a wound that has closed. They are a story of survival. They are real. I close the video and look out at my restaurant, at the world I built to protect myself from my family. I used to think of this place as my escape, the price I had to pay for my freedom. But I see now that I had it all backward. I had to go back. I had to face the lie. That phone call a year ago, that demand for money, wasn't a bill for a 30-year-old crime. It was an opportunity. By returning home to settle a debt that was never mine, I didn't just buy my brother a new knee. I paid the ransom for my entire family, liberating every single one of us from a prison we didn't even realize we were in. I was the only one who could turn the key. And I finally did.